Right, we're back live with you tonight here on In Focus. President addressing us just moments ago was on time, Ed, and of course addressing two areas which are critical for him to highlight as far as our standing in the world order. One is the outcomes of the 15th BRICS Summit and his analysis of what were some of the key important issues, and then of course that all-important report on what was loaded on that vessel known as Lady R that docked in Simonstown, which of course many alleged was filled with weapons that were then transported to Russia. Judge Phineas Mujapilu was heading a panel that looked into that, got some 100 documents, and some entities came there and reported, and most of them saying they had no independent knowledge of actually what took place there. But let's get some analysis. We're joined now by Africa-Asia Dialogues Director, Thembisa Fakude. Good to have you, sir. Thank you very much for your time tonight. Firstly, it's for me why the President would want to put the two together. The BRICS Summit, which would have been a feather in his cap, one of the shining moments for him. Right next to that, he says, I'll also slip in the outcomes of this report, which we'll know will have some kind of controversial outcomes for him, particularly considering the fact that he's just told us that he's not going to make the report public except to give us the executive summary, which is a version of a redacted version, pretty much, of what he told us tonight.
Yeah, it's a bit confusing. I mean, this started yesterday. On Friday, we got notification, at least the media and some analysts and commentators were summoned to go to listen to the president and ask questions at the Centre Convention Center. That was yesterday at 11 o'clock. And then today we again got the notification to come and listen to the president at 8 o'clock. One would have thought there was going to be much more a significant breaking news, but the President is telling us about something that was reported almost the entire duration extensively by almost every media institution in this country and abroad. So I'm not quite sure why we need a recap of what happened during BRICS almost 8 days later. This should have been done quite some time ago. So it's a very confusing kind of attempt to bring President back to the people, to kind of amplify his visibility. He has been, of course, as you know, absent for quite some time. So I think he's trying to resuscitate that and, add to his exposure and, availability, which he has over the past invited some criticism with many people saying is nowhere to be seen. So yeah. I couldn't understand why this was the case.
Albeit, let's reiterate in case somebody has been under a rock and doesn't know what has happened in the last 2 to 3 weeks as far as the 15th BRICS Summit is concerned. The President reiterating once again what we already know. BRICS is having new members. It's key, right? How significant is that? Having new members in the context, by the way, of whether or not these groups are in it to counterweight the weight of, I don't know whether it's a G7 or is it G20 or is it just the US in the world. Are they able, as a bloc now, to acquire the respect and the influence that they need?
Well, no, I don't think so. All I know is that these countries that are coming in, particularly the three from the Middle East, are known for basic violation of human rights and individual rights. Saudi Arabia went to Istanbul, Turkey, abducted Jamal Khashoggi, and known Washington Post journalist chopped his body and dissolved it in acid. You've got Iran, which is also now part of this BRICS, not long ago, arrested a girl who was not, or accused of not adorning a veil appropriately, banged her head against a police van, and she later died. Protests followed, and some protesters were arrested, and many of whom were sentenced to death for protesting. So these are the countries that are in there. United Arab Emirates, we know that it led, together with Saudi Arabia and other countries, a war, an unjust war in Yemen, where it killed thousands of people and displaced millions of people, which led to that conflict regarded as one of the greatest humanitarian disaster of our lifetime. Egypt is known for its violation of basic rights, with hundreds of activists jailed and journalists jailed, some of whom were my former colleagues. So, there's nothing to celebrate here. I know that you also talked about the expansion of the United Nations Security Council. The question is, why do we want to join a club that decides who lives and who dies, given our poor borders? We are going to be going into the United Nations Security Council, which most of the time declares wars and all kinds of things. With our poor borders, that's not necessarily a good thing to do. But again, it was a recap of what's been told, or what we have been listening to, and been covered extensively over the past couple of days. And for me, there's really nothing to celebrate with the expansion and inclusion, particularly of the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. It's important, of course, that you might just have some rapprochement. I think that's the only fact that's not been discussed. One is that Iran and Saudi Arabia has been at loggerheads for a very long time because of Saudi Arabia accusing Iran of Shia expansionism. Now they've got a platform through which they can have a discussion. Egypt and Ethiopia have been, again, having another challenge with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, with Egypt accusing Ethiopia of disturbing the flow of the Nile into Egypt. Now they are in one platform. That conflict is likely to be resolved. Again, the most important one is UAE in South Africa, with the Gupta brothers who are there, who are accused of looting lots of money from South Africa. Yeah. And we have been struggling to extradite them back to South Africa. Again, inclusion of UAE could facilitate it. But over and above that, I don't see anything positive, except that we have added countries that are continuing oppressing their own people.
So, yes, differences are bound to occur, as you put it. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, South Africa, UAE, with those groups there. It's not as if there were no differences already amongst the BRICS bloc already. We know of the tensions between China and India, for example, or China and Russia. We know there've been tensions there. But the president is saying this is a better platform to better align those voices. So what kind of consensus building initiatives would be able to happen here? Because others are looking at it and saying, because of the differences that which you have pointed out, this will just end up being another talk shop, but really no consensus building initiatives would actually materialize to anything here.
No, that's true. I don't think Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates have been struggling in terms of attracting investors. These are countries that are flooded by people who want to partner with them. Besides, there are a lot of bilaterals and multilaterals outside BRICS that have been functioning very well and promoting development and politics within these countries. I don't see why BRICS is actually essential in terms of pushing and promoting cooperation and economic development. We have the Africa Free Trade Agreement, which is also going to be doing exactly what we are told BRICS seeks to do. The discussion was actually quite interesting. The fact of using the various currencies in Africa to trade, etc. It's welcome. But other than that, I don't see anything changing because of BRICS. President Cyril Ramaphosa talked about the BRICS Youth Coalition or Council, Summit, which will encourage the exchange of youth. By the way, that's the very, very interesting discussion, which also means that we're likely to have certain visa regulations regarding the exchange of people dropping. And we have these very aggressive, educated, multilingual, fit-for-purpose youth from countries such as China, Russia, and India who are likely to be given an opportunity to South Africa. I'm not quite sure what that will do to the current unemployment rate in this country. And those are the kind of things that I think deserve a much more larger discussion between ourselves internally as South Africans, but also between ourselves and these countries. Yeah,
interesting that you also pointed it out, because the president also said, okay, despite having BRICS, by the way, it does nothing to the Africa Free Trade Agreement. That is in place. That is still going to continue. And that's also another way in which we can expand the export of more product into major markets. And then he goes on to say, despite the fact that we are part of this bloc, cooperation and respect with all nations is something that we will continue to maintain. Our non-aligned approach has not changed.
Yeah, we know about that, but at the same time, the same non-aligned approach was contradicted when South Africa decided to host the arms drills known as the Musi, military arms drill earlier on this year on the 24th of February, or during the 24th of February. That was the very same day when the Ukrainians were commemorating the invasion of their country. So, sure, it's an unaligned position, but we continue doing things and uttering statements that are totally contrary to what we purport to be doing. At the same time, you have the minister in the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, Dr. Nali Depando, sitting with a politician from Russia and telling the world that Russia is their friend and no one will dictate that relationship. So it's very confusing at best. But moreover, you have a president who goes and says that they have suspended or pulled out of the ICC, and the very next day he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. It was a mistake." So these are the kind of things that continue to confuse me, at least. And for some of us who comment on various platforms internationally, we find it sometimes very difficult to explain South African position, particularly regarding Ukraine.
The new financial payment system, because something that was discussed broadly, but the president telling us that one of the outcomes is that the finance ministers of the various countries would need to then go out and iron out exactly how this is going to happen. The one debate is around, China at first thought maybe their currency would be better suited to be the common currency in terms of being the more dominant one and reducing the dominance of the US dollar. But following the COVID situation, their economy is also unstable at this particular point, so battered. So maybe don't have such a strong standing on that one. But whatever new currency needs to come out here, it must be able to be a currency that would gain trust amongst the member states. How do you see that playing out?
Well, I've heard them talking about the multi-currency. In other words, each country using its own currency to trade, which I think is a great deal. The idea of a BRICS currency, I don't think is going to happen anytime soon, at least not in our lifetime. The dollar will continue to dominate the international market, and people will continue transacting using the dollar. But the idea that Africans must or will start using their own currency to trade is a great one. It's been very inconveniencing for all of us to going and buying dollars in order for us to trade overseas. So if that passes, I think that will be the greatest development, and it's something that will have to be commended. That is the multi-currency usage in terms of transacting within the African continent, which I think is something that the African Trade Agreement is already looking at and doing.
So the BRICS bloc then came up with this thing called the New Development Bank, right? Can the expansion of BRICS also make a contribution to the expansion of the New Development Bank and therefore fulfill that aim of changing lending policies? Because one of the big things about the New Development Bank is to change lending policies, because you've got the IMFs of this world who would put particular conditions on them giving money to African countries and so on and so forth. And they are hoping this would be a vehicle that would be powerful enough to be able to change that kind of environment.
I think it's a good idea. I think it will add to diverse multi-lending agencies and platforms. But again, the concern is how much are we contributing as South Africans? Are we going to be equal contributors to all of these countries that have got larger populations, or is this going to be calculated based on the size of the economy and the size of the population? Because if you are expected to be contributing the equal amount that China, Brazil, India, and other countries that have deep pockets and got larger populations, I can tell you now that we are going to face challenges in terms of us accessing those funds, because we are, number one, going to be outnumbered. Number two is we are likely to get much more attractive pitches from these other countries in terms of accessing. I mean, at the end of the day, this is going to be business. So if you're going to have competing with 2.8 billion, that is India and China combined, and bringing in Brazil, etc., as South Africans to be competing to accessing those funds, and there's no preferential measure applied, we might just find ourselves disadvantaged by being part of this new African bank or new development bank.
Thembisa Fakude is the CEO of the Merlin Guardian and Director for Africa-Asia dialogues. And President Cyril Ramaphosa was addressing us moments ago on two issues, of course, the outcomes of the BRICS summit and the report on the Lady R. That is the ship that docked in Simonstown, and there were lots of allegations around what was loaded onto that ship as it made its way out to Russia. Let's get some analysis on that. And President firstly says that we, of course, quickly put this panel together. It was led by Judge Phineas Mujapilo and others. Hundreds of documents were submitted. We spoke to various people, entities who claimed to have some kind of evidence to the effect to say what was actually loaded and where it went. And saying when we approached those people, it seemed they were now backtracking and said, look, we actually don't have any independent knowledge of what was actually put into that ship. So the panel had a difficult time getting any evidence. From what I'm sensing, that no allegations were proven to be true. None of the persons who made the allegations had any evidence to support their allegations. However, the panel did find that the functioning of this conventional arms control committee needs some looking at. Two, better communication between the ministers and the various bodies, and there's also some inadequacy in terms of the admin processes. Apart from that, the President says, no, it's a clean bill of health. What do you make of that?
Well, yeah, that's what it says. We're going to get an executive summary, understandably, because of some sensitive material that's in there. But again, for some of us who are skeptical, we'll only believe the president when you see the full report. Now we are getting a summarized version. So we'll have to wait for tomorrow to read that. But I just feel for Robin Piketty, the U.S. ambassador to South Africa, who I'm sure was listening very closely to this, on how he feels about this. And I think, notwithstanding there is a sigh of relief from him, at least he can still have some sort of talking point to say, I still stand by my word, because not the entire report was released. But we'll have to believe what the president tells us. Is his word, and I'm sure the larger part of the report won't be released. And I think Robin Piketty regrets that he uttered those statements prematurely, and he was rebuked both here and at home. And but he's staying in South Africa, of course. So it's a sigh of relief to an extent, I think, to him, that the report is not going to be released in its entirety.
Is it an indication, as the president says, that he might have spoken prematurely but made comments without having the proof, which he said, by the way, he's got on good authority when he was making the remarks that he knows for sure on good authority that arms were loaded on that ship heading to Russia? We ask that because, as you put it, except for the reprimand, nothing has happened to him. He's still in the country. And if the president is as serious as he says he is about clearing this issue, which has tarnished the image of the country, battered our rand at some point, our economy suffered because of it, is this all is he going to do? He's going to release an executive summary and say, well, there's no evidence, and that's it?
Well, we need a full summary. I mean, we need a full report so that we can all be rest assured that actually nothing happened. Judge Mujapilo is a very respected judge, and I'm sure he's taken everything into consideration and interviewed those people that were willing to be interviewed, and those that were not willing to be interviewed will give them the benefit of the doubt. But there's a lot at the moment after the president spoke that, for me, require full disclosure, and I'll only be comfortable to comment and take a position against Piketty and the Lady R issue when I see, whenever that is, the full report on what actually happened. All we know is that the president told us that hundreds of people were interviewed, some didn't want to be interviewed, and others were interviewed, and there was no evidence that there was something loaded into the Lady R, and that's his word, and we have to believe it and take the report that's going to be released tomorrow as the absolute truth and move on. And that's what, of course, we're expected to do. But again, that's not going to happen. There'll always be that cloud hanging about the actual one, not only the goods that were offloaded, but the entire report will only convince us as South Africans that actually there was nothing amiss with what happened in the Lady R saga.
Yeah, equipment was ordered. I'm using that equipment term quite loosely because we're not even sure what that equipment was. But what we do know, it was equipment for the South African National Defence Force, and it was equipment that was ordered by Armsco, which, I mean, it doesn't take rocket science for us to figure out that it had to do with arms, certainly. That would have been supplied. And he says, which I found quite interesting, he says that the supplier had no restriction in terms of what means it could use to transport the so-called equipment to come into the country. So the fact that it used Lady R is by and large a non-issue.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. We're supposed to believe this. Notwithstanding that the president correctly mentions about, us having to, have access to these kind of things. But again, we're treated as if we're just, not people qualified enough to read this kind of reports, and we're going to be given this kind of information and end of story, close the chapter and move on. And I don't think it should be the case. I think the president is gotten used to not being tackled, particularly in terms of tougher questions from journalists. And this time around, again, he chose to use his 8 o'clock family address, knowing very well that there's not going to be any questions coming his way. So it's just, if he was really serious about us getting to know more about this, he should have at least gave this presentation yesterday, where all journalists, commentators and analysts were invited to the Sentin Convention Center, and they could have easily given us this report and allowed journalists to question him. So he used this very safe, comfortable, protected platform to issue such controversial statements, including the Lady R one. And he knows very well that it's not going to be, questioned, it's not going to be tackled by the media, and we must just take what it gives us and move on.
So, certainly one of the things that the panel is finding as an adverse finding is the communication between the relevant ministers and I suppose the various entities that would need to have been involved in this. One would say, well, I suppose that's the sickness, that's the blight in President Cyril Ramaphosa's administration, this poor communication. As you say, he himself sometimes says things that have got to be retracted by his spokesperson at a later stage.
No, that's true. This is not only just poor communication, it's also taking people for granted. The fact that, again, as I've said earlier on, I don't think we deserve to be given a recap of what happened at BRICS. We covered this very extensively over the past week. And this was used as a preamble to a much more bigger presentation, which is the Lady R will not given except that tomorrow. So this is it's a commonplace within the communication structures, not only of the president but also of government, that they can choose what to say and what not to say. But for me, importantly, is that the president has been treated with kid's gloves by many, including the media and us as analysts and commentators. He never really tackles those questions. Today he gave us a report that most of us have been waiting for, and he gave it through his normal television address, and that's it. Drop the bomb and leave, and don't expect to be questioned. And I think that's problematic. And again, as I've said earlier on, if he was really serious about clarifications and really tackling these issues seriously and passing relevant crucial information to the public, this was supposed to be done yesterday. Yesterday he called a meeting of all journalists and senior journalists, including analysts, to Sentin Convention Center, and this was never raised because he knew that some journalists could have easily asked him very difficult and tough questions, which probably couldn't have much more comfortable way of dealing a controversial press statement.
Yeah, that the connection letting us down there towards the end. But let me see, drop the bomb and leave, literally. The president saying all these things, he's reporting on them because they have a direct bearing on the country's relations with the rest of the world? Well, he's heading to Zimbabwe, it seems, to the inauguration of Emmerson Mnangagwa, while we are reporting, of course, that those elections are being disputed. What does that say in terms of our relations to the rest of the world and how the world has viewed those elections?
Well, two reports, SAGC, South African Development Community report, and the European Union report have, judged or termed those elections as not meeting the democratic standards. We know that there has been pre-election violence and there's some violence and intimidation during the elections. And before that, there was the patriotic bill that was passed by President Mnangagwa, which states that anyone who criticizes the government could face jail term. And these elections occurred under those circumstances, with basically means that those who wanted to criticize the president or ZANU-PF, or those who wanted to campaign, couldn't do that freely because of this patriotic bill, which could have seen them jailed for criticizing the government. So this is the kind of government that you're dealing with, continually oppressing, suppressing people and free political activity, particularly during this very important time. And President Cyril Ramaphosa, of course, has got no choice as an important neighbor but to attend. My only concern, of course, is that I hope that the ANC and the South African government stop becoming the foot soldiers and the lobbyists of Zimbabwe in terms of calling for the lifting of sanctions.
All right.
Because clearly President Mnangagwa and his government are not interested in peace and justice in that country.
Let's leave it there. Much appreciated. Thanks for your time. Africa-Asia Dialogue Director, and CEO of the Mail and Guardian there, Thembisa Fakude.